So the church has selected this passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, beginning with verse 1. Now, after 6 days, Jesus received together Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them to a high mountain privately. And he was transformed before them, and his face shone as the sun, and his garments became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And having answered, Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I shall make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But while he was still talking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud was heard, saying, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And the disciples, having heard, fell on their faces and feared greatly. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise, and don't be afraid." And having opened their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus alone. This is the gospel of Christ. Thanks be to God. Did you see the movie Stargate when it came out a few years ago? Of course, there's been a popular television series that was a spin-off of the movie. It was a wonderful movie, especially if, like me, you're fascinated with things like quantum mechanics and time travel. Actually, the premise of the story comes right off the front pages of the latest archaeological journals. If you read that kind of stuff, I confess I do, though I'm not proud of it. When I left Gardner-Webb as the dean of the divinity school, I tried to give up reading that kind of thing. But alas, it just keeps beckoning me back like the sirens of Odysseus. And so I find myself still taking it and still reading it. I'm tapering off a bit. I only read Biblical Archaeological Review now. But in any case, there was a story in Biblical Archaeological Review not long ago about the 3 pyramids of Giza. Perhaps some of you have been to Cairo and have been to the plateau of Giza and have seen those very famous pyramids. The pyramids there have puzzled the archaeologists for years. For a variety of reasons, we're not really sure how they got there, or who built them, or even how old they are. But there are 2 reasons that they puzzle archaeologists and scholars in particular. The first is the 3 pyramids are not all the same size. 2 of them are roughly the same size, but then there is a 3rd pyramid that is smaller than the other 2, which is the second reason they puzzle scholars. Not only is the 3rd smaller than the other 2, but it's misaligned. It appears as though the 3 pyramids are to be in a straight line, and the 2 larger ones are, but the 3rd one is not only smaller, but slightly offset. Now, there have been all sorts of theories and speculations about that, but a group of archaeologists apparently had an idea that they would call in an astronomer for a different take. And so there was an astronomer who was called to site to give his take on the pyramids. And when he arrived, the first thing he asked for was, "Do you have any aerial photographs of the pyramids?" To which the archaeologist replied, "Aerial photographs? Sure, but why?" He said, "Just a hunch." And so they brought him aerial photographs, and when he looked at them, he said, "There it is." And they said, "There what is?" And he said, "Well, can't you see it? Orion. It's the constellation Orion." And sure enough, when you look at the pyramids from the top down, they look just like the belt in Orion. 2 bright stars with a smaller 3rd star slightly offset from the other 2. Extraordinary. And of course, you can only see that if you observe the pyramids, not the way most of us observe them, but from a supra-terrestrial perspective. Well, the movie Stargate extended that premise to suggest that visitors from another world had instructed the ancient Egyptians to build the pyramids as sort of extraterrestrial road signs of a sort to guide them in their journeys to and from the earth. Now, if that sounds far-fetched, it is quite widely known that the pyramids are not just tombs. They are also stargates of sorts in which the pyramids were placed, believing that these stargates, these launching pads, would launch them into their journeys into the afterlife. Well, according to the movie, during some excavations at Giza back in the 40s, the movie suggests, a portal was discovered inscribed with hieroglyphs. And when the hieroglyphs were translated, the portal suddenly, magically, would transform itself into a stargate through which one could pass into all sorts of extraterrestrial and otherworldly journeys. The premise of the movie. Now, if that sounds vaguely familiar to you, apart from the Stargate series, it should. The idea that there's more to life than meets the eye. The idea that I'm from here, but I'm not really home here. Or in the language of our old hymnody, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. If that idea, if that notion sounds familiar to you, that there is some door, if we could just find the portal, the door, we could go through the door and be transported into these mystical, marvelous journeys into other worlds. It's a common theme in literature and in film. It is, of course, the theme of Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. Instead of a Stargate portal, it is a mirror. It is the theme of C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, only there it's neither a portal nor a mirror. It's a wardrobe. Part the clothes, and through the other side of the wardrobe into another world. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz, only the medium of transportation there is a cyclone. And, of course, the recent movie trilogy, The Matrix. It's a common theme in literature, and it is also the theme of our sermon lesson for this morning. The story in the Gospel of Matthew we sometimes call the Transfiguration. In the Gospel of Matthew, the story takes place immediately following Jesus asking his disciples an important question about himself up at Banyas, Caesarea Philippi, in the northern part of the Galilee. He gathers his disciples there privately alone, and then he asks them, okay, what's the Gallup poll saying about me out there? What are they saying? What are they talking about? And of course, lots of confusion emerges. Well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Jeremiah or John the Baptist or one of the prophets. Well, what do you think? What do you guys think? And Simon Peter answers for the group and says, you're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. And then, as though God himself had been listening in on that conversation, according to Matthew, God adds his own answer. And the answer takes the form of that story we call the Transfiguration. Theologically, we call that an epiphany. Epiphany, a marvelous word from two Greek words, epi meaning upon, phaneo meaning to shine upon, or perhaps a better translation, a breakthrough, an appearance. Something breaks through and manifests itself. And so theologically, we call the Transfiguration an epiphany story. It is an epiphany, but in experience, I think a better way to describe it is by calling it the shout. It's kind of a shout. It's as though God, listening in on this, thunders down from heaven, yes, this is my Son. This is the Christ. This is the Messiah. Now, most of the time, God doesn't shout. Most of the time, God only whispers. And the only people who hear the voice of God are those who are listening for it, those who are leaning forward, those who are watching, scanning the sky and peering the heavens, looking for a sign or a voice from God. Most of the time, God whispers. When the Messiah was born, The world, by and large, was absolutely clueless that an event had taken place that would split time in two. According to the Gospels, the only people who knew about it were the shepherds, quiet and still out in the fields tending their sheep, and some Iranian astrologers who were studying the heavens, believing that the heavens would give them a sign as to a great and stupendous event that would take place. But most of the time, most of the world is clueless about what God is saying or doing in the world. I mean, they're too busy. They've got things to do, jobs to do, families to raise, places to go, people to see. We don't have time to listen for God's voice. And so most of the time, God is whispering, and most of the time, we're oblivious to it. It was Elizabeth Barrett Browning who wrote, of course, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush aflame with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries." And so, God whispers. I remember some years ago I was teaching at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary back in the 80s, and that was the year a marvelous, marvelous new play hit Broadway, a musical actually, and it was so successful that it went on tour and it was brought to Kansas City to the Lyric Theater there. The play, the musical, was the musical version of Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables. I was an undergraduate English major in college. I had read the novel, and I was enthralled. How in the world are they going to make this dark, dark story into a musical? I couldn't believe it. And so my wife and I and some colleagues at the seminary decided we would buy tickets and go to the Lyric and watch it. And we did, and it was amazing. It was extraordinary. Not only did they pull it off, they took my breath away. The characters that I had come to know in Victor Hugo's novel, Jean Valjean and Javert and Fantine, not only did they tell their stories, but the musical gave them the opportunity to sing their story. And so story would harmonize and intertwine with story in ways that could never be accomplished in just a novel or a play. It was extraordinary. And the themes, unbelievable. Poverty and man's inhumanity to man, and treachery and villainy, and forgiveness and hope and grace and love. For 3 hours, I just sat there in a stupor watching this magnificent play take place. And when the play was over, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I was just drained emotionally from the experience. Finally, I managed to stand to my feet. And as I turned to leave, there was a man who had been sitting behind me through the entire production. I'd seen him there during the intermission. Sat behind me through the entire production, saw what I saw. I turned, we made eye contact. He looks at me and says, "Well, do you think Marty Schottenheimer's going to coach the Chiefs next year?" Now, I'm thinking, where have you been? You were here, but you weren't here. You heard it, but you didn't hear it. Most of the time, God whispers. And only those who are leaning forward ever hear it. But sometimes he shouts. I remember when I was in my PhD studies at Southern Seminary back in the 70s. It was an exhilarating time, but it was a tough time for my wife and me. I was pastoring a church full time. I was teaching New Testament at the seminary as an instructor. And we were doing everything we could to try to eke out a living. And my theological education was a great boon to me as a result of the benefit of gifts through Baptist churches like this one and others, through the cooperative program. It made the kind and quality of education I had almost cost-free. It was just, I could not have afforded to have gone to some of the best schools and gotten the kind of education I got had it not been for those gifts from people like you in congregations like this. But in the PhD program, Before you begin to write your doctoral dissertation, you have to go off a year and study somewhere else to prevent academic inbreeding. They want you to study with other people so that you just don't stir the same old gruel all the time. And there were people going to Harvard and Yale and Vanderbilt and University of Chicago. I went to a rabbinical school. I'm a New Testament expert and a New Testament backgrounds expert. I wanted to study Rabbinic Judaism, so I went to Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio, and studied with the rabbis for a year. It was a marvelous experience, but very, very expensive. And Cheryl and I were determined we were not going to incur any debt because, you were not going to be able to pay off a large debt in the kind of salaries you make in the ministry. So we were not going to incur a large debt. We saved and we saved and we saved. Just about the time the semester was going to matriculate, we came up $250 short. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but back in the 70s, and for us, that was a lot of money. It may as well have been $1,000. And we tried every way we could to come up with the money, couldn't come up with the money. Reluctantly, sadly, finally, we resolved I would drop out of school that one semester, and we would work and continue to save the money until we could afford to go to that year of cognate studies. I was resigned to it. I was supposed to preach that Sunday. I went to check the mail on Saturday. There was a letter in the mail. I opened the letter. It was from someone I didn't know. A check fell out. I started to read the letter. It was from someone at a church where I had preached a revival 10 months earlier. I had forgotten being there. And he writes this letter to me. He said, "You won't remember me, but you were at our church about a year ago and you preached a revival. I don't know why, but I just suddenly felt compelled," that was his word, compelled to write to you. I don't know whether you need this or this will help you, but I just somehow felt the need to write and to make a small investment in your ministry. And I picked up the check and looked at, anybody want to guess how much the check was for? Sometimes God shouts. The Transfiguration was a divine shout. God was shouting, "This is my Son." But what does it all mean, these divine shouts, these glimpses of glory, these epiphanies? Well, the person who usually helps me has helped me here, C.S. Lewis, my favorite writer, my favorite author. He wrote a book which I think is the best book on the miracles ever written, called Miracles. And in that little book, he talks about two different kinds of miracles, what he calls miracles of the old creation and miracles of the new creation. The difference being this: miracles of the old creation are those events in the life of Jesus when he does suddenly and locally, close and small, something God does every day on such a grand scale nobody notices. Like turning water into wine. God turns water into wine every day. It is the process of growing the grapes, water taken into the grapes, the fermentation process, and all of the rest. God turns water into wine every day. It just takes him a while. And of course, God doesn't keep time the way we keep time. And so in God's time, he's turning water into wine every day. But what if God were to become a human being? And all of that power were to get focused and localized in one human being. Isn't it logical that what happens every day so slowly and on such a grand scale, you never attribute it to God, suddenly God does it instantly? It's the same with the healing miracles. Whenever someone is healed, when Jesus touches them, it is an example of divine healing. All healing is ultimately divine healing. Physicians don't heal you. All physicians will tell you that. They do one of two things. They either, through the use of drugs, chemotherapies, and other processes, accelerate the body's own natural healing processes, or they remove that which is inhibiting the body's own natural healing processes. But physicians don't heal anybody. Ever heard of a cut being healed on a corpse? They can't heal you without your knowledge or consent. All healing is finally divine healing. Miracles of the old creation, God doing close and small, quickly and suddenly, something he does every day, but so slowly and on such a vast scale, it escapes your attention. It is a whisper. But miracles of the new creation are different. If miracles of the old creation are sort of a whispered shout. Miracles of the new creation are a shouted whisper. They're epiphanies, they're metaphor moments where another world breaks in and breaks through. Transcendence itself is pulled like a blanket over our time. Eternity pulled like a blanket. And then it spikes down and manifests itself and reveals itself to us so that we catch a glimpse of something that has always been there, but we didn't notice it. Tom Long, friend of mine, is professor of preaching at Emory University, tells about one of those moments in his own life. He had an 8-year-old daughter. She's grown now, but at the time he had a little 8-year-old daughter who was studying ballet. And of course, they were thrilled when she started studying ballet and taking ballet. And then after a while, they were wondering whether it was such a good idea. She drove them crazy learning all of the dance steps. And no matter what they were doing, she would rush in, watch this, watch me. And of course, Tom said, I couldn't get anything done. One Saturday, he was working on a manuscript that was already late to the publisher, sitting there in a chair. The window was open, the sun was streaming through. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. His little 8-year-old bursts in the room. Watch this, Daddy, watch this. Fine, honey, that's great. And he goes back to his manuscript. Daddy, you're not watching. Watch this. And he looks up and catches a glimpse of his daughter standing there in front of the window, sun streaming through like a golden spotlight, catching her blonde hair. And she does a pirouette, and as she turns around, the sun hits her hair just perfectly, and just for a moment, he says, as her hair followed her around, it was as if she were in slow motion. Time seemed to stop. And as he caught her face as she turned around, he didn't see his 8-year-old daughter at all. He saw this beautiful young woman, confident and poised, with not an ounce of self-consciousness. And he said, it took my breath away. And then she finished the pirouette and she turned around, and there she was again, his little 8-year-old girl. Watch me, Daddy, watch me. He said it was as though time stopped, and a new kind of time, which was time past and time present and time to come, all balled up into one, suddenly burst into that room. The Transfiguration is a miracle of the new creation. A glimpse of glory that reminds us that there is more here than meets the eye. That the prosaic and the pedestrian are not the whole story. That every now and again, holiness shines through the humanness. And we see it all clearly, even if we don't see it all fully. Sometimes, for reasons only He knows, God shouts. Frederick Buechner, who was a freelance Christian writer and ordained minister in Vermont, tells a story about inviting a friend up to his home during sugaring time in the spring. And all the sugar maples have their taps on them, these little galvanized buckets. And early in the morning, Buechner says, my inspiration is to walk through the forest of the sugar maples, and you can hear the tap, drip, drip of the sap falling into those galvanized buckets, hundreds of them. He said his friend had never seen that and wanted to experience that. He said, well, we'll get up early in the morning. You won't believe this. It's an amazing experience. And so they do. They start walking through the woods, and shafts of golden sunlight like gold spotlights hitting those little galvanized aluminum buckets. And it was so quiet, absolutely still, except for the drip, drip, drip of the sap. Buechner turned to his friend and he said, have you ever tasted sugar maple sap? He said, no, but I'd like to. And Buechner said, well, you're in for a treat. It's as thin as water, crystal clear. It has no sweetness at all when it hits your mouth, when it hits your palate, but just before you think it has no taste, suddenly sweetness just bursts on you. It's amazing. Well, his friend was much taller than Buechner, so Buechner took one of the little buckets off the tree, off the tap, and he told his friend, now you're going to have to kneel down because I can't get this to your lips with your standing. And so his friend knelt down in the forest with shafts of golden sunlight like spotlights illumining him. And Buechner bends down and takes the bucket and puts it to his lips. And as he tilts it up, just before the life's blood of that tree touches his lips, his friend looks up at him and says, wait a minute. Shouldn't you be saying some words or something? And when they lifted their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus alone. Sometimes it happens that way, and we glimpse the glory, and suddenly we see it all clearly, if not fully, who he really is, and who we really are, and what in him we were meant to be. But the cross comes before the crown. And tomorrow is a Monday. And I predict that by midweek, life will have settled back over you like a brown fog on a winter's dawn, and the golden shafts of Sunday's glory will have given way to the sackcloth and ashes of Wednesday's shame. I remind you, you can't get to Easter without going through Lent, because there can be no resurrection until somebody dies. It's the way of things in this world. But while I can't pitch my tent and live in the light, I can remember that I've been graced with a glimpse of glory. I've seen the door. I've heard the voice shouting a whisper from the other side. And though I've never actually been to the other side, you understand, because I've glimpsed the glory, I think I know the way. I think I do.